I'm listening to The Untethered Soul, and I'm very defensive about some very core pains that I'm still sorting out. um, and so I'm yeah, so I'm one of the things that's going through my mind right now is the awareness that Michael Singer, I think that's it, by Michael Singer, as he was writing this book, he was defending a lawsuit and spent $190 million defending a lawsuit against the government to protect the truth that he was not a corrupt man and had not conspired to take kickbacks as part of his multi-million-dollar company, invoicing doctors and things of that nature. And I'm defending an attack by my therapist who, rather than dealing with some of the things that concern me about their future therapy work, decided to throw at me that I was a sexual predator and a pedophile. As part of a public exchange, which I brought into public because he wouldn't deal with things privately, so I just told him, whatever we're talking about, let's let the public be aware of what's going on. And I get that the therapist is at their limit because, this is the opposite of healthy therapy, and so, it takes someone at their edge to attack a client with a somewhat insane, I'm not sure what quite his bits are, but that's why I'm bringing this up. And so if we listen to this last bit here, and this is very true.
Into your personal sensitivity. Once you've made the commitment to free yourself of that scared person inside, you will notice that there is a clear decision point at which your growth takes place. Spiritual growth is about the point at which you start to feel your energy change. For instance, somebody says something, and you start to feel the energy get a little strange inside. You will actually start to feel a tightening. That is your cue that it's time to grow. It's not time to defend yourself, because you don't want the part of you that you would be defending. If you don't want it, let it go. You will eventually get conscious enough.
If you don't want it, let it go. And so I'm assuming that if Michael Sitvar or Michael Singer didn't defend himself, he'd be in jail because a whistleblower at his company went to the DOJ and convinced a federal prosecutor that that Michael Singer was a corrupt company leader in cahoots to scam the public, etc. And the federal prosecutor managed to convince the jury of that. And but thanks to $190 million in legal fees and the fact that they were innocent, the judge understood that there was absolutely no evidence other than one man who was complicit in a corruption scheme, and that was the person that the DOJ made the deal with. And there was a bit of face saving and all of that. And so I believe that Michael Singer was innocent of that, and I believe that, and the judge obviously thought so, and throughout the case. And this was outlined in the book The Surrender Experiment. And yet, how do you mount a $190 million lawsuit and present that, or a $190 million legal defense to defend one's innocence as part of a surrender experiment? And I get it on a on an energetic level, what he's talking about. It takes enormous energy. I mean, $190 million in a legal defense fund is about the same as the amount of psychic energy it takes to, for example, in this case, push back to a supposed trauma therapist who's asserting not only that that I'm a sexual pedophile and a sexual predator, but that's why he couldn't work with me and is having difficulty dealing with the patterns that I'm bringing up that don't feel aligned with the data in in therapy. And it takes energy to protect something that's true and beautiful and good when you have a corrupted power mass around you. And it takes energy to defend the body from all of the parasites and stuff that, want to come in and take over the body. It takes energy to feed the body. It takes energy to liquefy the body. It takes energy to breathe. But that's in the supposition that the body is worth protecting. It's worth living. And I wrote to Michael, and there's a defense system in having the letter come through. Because he doesn't give his email account, which is a protection of his personal space. So I sent it to someone at his meditation center who said they would pass the email to them. And instead they passed it to his publicist. And and the publicist said that in answer to a long email They said, Dane, the gist of what Michael's trying to say is, to surrender to, to something beyond the ego. And my reply was, do you mean the way that Michael Singer is hiring a publicist to block communication with the audience? And she didn't reply, presumably surrendering to silence. And so my sense is, if you want to carry the surrender paradigm and look at it, through to the ultimate, take it to the ultimate degree, is, if I look at my dog, who's part of our ecology, I'm part of nature, the dog is part of nature, the species, this is part of nature, it's all part of an ecology. And so if you surrender to that ecology, and say, this is the reality that is, my dog barks every time something unfamiliar and threatening to the dog comes in, and spends great energy barking. And then I spend energy to try and quiet the dog. Say, come on, this is my friend. Stop barking. Well, the dog wants to resist my putting energy to silence the dog and keep showing, the defense. And so it seems as if to ultimately surrender, one has to surrender to the ecology in which there is defense. And to surrender to nature's movement, which includes a system of defense and aggression, in which one paradigm is this survival of the fittest, but then you have the fittest is also that which partners. Synergy is a stronger form of existence than isolation, and so you have partnering. What does Michael Singer do when one of his employees turns him into the DOJ to attack his credibility and his firm? He defends his credibility and he defends his firm. Presumably, if someone starts raping Michael's wife, hopefully that's more important to him than a company image, he would do a variety of things to try and de-escalate that, including, if necessary, hitting the guy over the head. Is his wife's dignity, etc., worth defending, or would he advise his wife to allow the rape while going to court to protect the dignity of a company? And you can say there's a defense against insanity here, because if one just allows Michael Singer's entire dialogue to go through without challenge, then how do you not participate in the pain that results? For example, if I don't challenge a therapist involved with, and there's my dog right there, he's heard a noise and he's going to defend. So there's absolutely no doubt that it takes vast amounts of energy both to assert and to defend anything. I'm just drinking. It took energy to take my vitamins in a smoothie. And it takes energy to breathe. It took energy to get this camera. It took energy to take it out of to the deck. It takes energy to think. It takes energy to feel. And there's a great joy in surrender. There's a great transcendence and pleasure in just letting go. And if you just let go long enough, with a discipline, the body disappears because you don't get any water, you stop spending energy to breathe, you stop spending energy to eat, you don't get out of bed. There's a great, there's a great conservation of energy in dying, because it takes a lot of energy to exist in a dualistic paradigm, in a dualistic system. And yet, to a certain extent, consciousness emerges in that tension and in the language which takes energy to learn and energy to speak and energy to think in the patterns of that language. And so it takes energy to reach out to Michael and say, what do you mean here? And of course it will take less energy of Michael's to say nothing, to defend that paradox with silence, in a sense, because here's someone writing a book about surrender and transcendence while participating in one of the bigger legal court cases of the country to defend the innocence of a corporation and defend the right of his body to be out of a cell and to defend the truth, and in the writing of a book to defend the idea of surrender, to say, because memes travel through the culture like ideas, and in the United States there is a great emphasis on the idea of the individual and on capitalism and on making money. There's a great deal in all of these different emphasis on these things, so people defend them with guns and with passion and with betraying their families to hold on to land or to make an extra dollar. They leave their children at home to go do this, and Michael is defending the soul, is saying, hey, pay attention, there's this other way here, and I'm going to sit down and spend vast amounts of energy writing all this down so that the ecology of thought is broader than it would be otherwise. And I am for all of that. I appreciate Michael's book. I appreciate his presence. I appreciate his reminder. I appreciate that he defended his honor. I appreciate that he reminds our government of its abuses. I appreciate that he publicized spending energy, because the DOJ's reputation goes down and Michael Singer's reputation goes up as a result of that narrative, to the extent that you spend energy to believe, to cohere with Michael's thoughts. And so the only thing that to the extent that I greatly respect the truth and the energy that Michael is talking about in, I'm not sure why he calls it the untethered soul, because I would have called it the integrated soul or something else. It doesn't really matter. But just that we as a culture include meditation in the soul. And so there's a paradox present. And it takes energy to unravel the paradox. It takes no energy to be insane or to pretend that there's no mixed message going on there. But I'm curious if Michael has the language, which would take effort, maybe surrendering to the language. Who knows? I mean, you can look at it all as assertion. You can look at it all as surrender. It takes great effort to try and piece out why you would defend the reputation of a company. And then you can say, well, those innocent people, that shouldn't lose their job and da-da-da. You're defending what's good in that. Just as the scam artist in question, as in Michael's words, this was a con artist, would be defending his ability to get more money and for something he thought was good. I mean, maybe he wanted a Ferrari or whatever that he thought was good, and so he's doing that. And you could just say, isn't it wonderful that the con artist has figured out this, and isn't it wonderful that someone else is mad at the con artist, and isn't it wonderful that the con artist is going to be throwing me in jail, and I'll be able to, because if you look at the possible narratives of this story, let's say that Michael Singer went to jail and didn't defend anything. Well, it turned out once he was indicted by the DOJ, they would not let him talk to the prisoners. This was a great service Michael was doing to the prisoners. And I loved him for it, and it alerted me that we're dealing with something substantive that's transcending our cultural label system of you are people who are not worth anything and you are people that are important. Because at that point in the culture, Michael is a respected meditator who's running a corporation and da-da-da and is competent as a coder, and then he's transcending the fact that the culture is saying that he's important, but these prisoners are not important. They are to be treated like shit. And Michael, in a certain sense, is participating in that message. I didn't hear his anger at the guards or the prison system for systematically damaging our culture by isolating people rather than helping them integrate and heal. So I've had a lot of respect for Michael for going into the prisons, and I admire that. But if Michael had truly been undefended, he would have ended up in prison rather than being separated from the prisoners, and could have done some of his most important work in prison as a prisoner, where he might have touched a lot more prisoners. So why did he defend and push that reality away to protect the image of the corporation and the jobs, etc., when one could say the prisoners have a lot more medicine? Meaning it's far more medicinal for someone to be in a prison system on the inside responding and writing about this in prison than it is to not be able to go and talk with the prisoners because you've been indicted with the DOJ, but you've defended your innocence. So this is a question that is being defended against. Meaning, I'd be curious if I fly down to Florida and encounter Michael, which would take extraordinary amounts of energy. That's one of the reasons I contacted his staff. As I said, I could come and deliver this by hand to Michael in meditation. And that will require, shutting down my business for a time, getting on a plane, consuming fuel, driving there, consuming fuel, staying in a hotel, spending lots of money, etc., to hand Michael a letter. And how would he respond? And so I note this paradox of the defense around Michael is such that such an enormous amount of energy might be necessary in order to penetrate the defense. That is stopping the surrender into this. And so my sense of symmetry is such that most things, I'm a designer, need a counterpoint. In good landscape design, you consciously engineer a paradox in which about half of the things are highly structured and about half of the things are very informal. And this creates a pleasing aesthetic to our consciousness, which is a consciousness that has been given birth to in the $5 billion or the 5 billion year old culture that Michael, sometimes ranting a bit, will tell you you're crazy to fight. So I'm crazy to fight with a 5 billion year old evolutionary system by trying to change something and say that shouldn't be the way it is. But Michael has the audacity to fight an entire culture's dogmatic consciousness that has emerged out of a 5 billion year old ecosystem. Meaning, I am a product of a 5 billion year old ecosystem that produced amongst millions of species human beings, and amongst human beings, certain human beings that think, and certain human beings that ask questions, and certain human beings that read books, and certain human beings that read Michael Singer's books, who's produced by the same 5 billion year old ecology. And out of that emerges what emerges. And this is a part of that. And so if Michael then says, no, you're stupid for trying to fight this system, you should do it my way of surrendering to the fact that I don't want to answer my email. The question is, on what mathematical basis is that asserted, energy expended, where he'll go to a crowd and say, you're crazy to fight the system, just surrender. But he drove to the crowd, and he's telling a crowd that doesn't behave that way that they should change. and sometimes getting a little impatient when they don't. I could tell he was frustrated when one group I watched on YouTube didn't have questions for him. So he said, right, so you're all just going to do this? You have no questions? You're all just going to surrender? And it's like he was irritated because everyone wasn't going to change because of his great speech and his great epiphany. Now, he's one part of nature that has had an epiphany, talking about to another part of nature that hasn't had an epiphany, that are both part of a 5 billion-year-old ecosystem. And then here's another part of the 5 billion-year-old ecosystem noticing that and communicating that, and then there are other parts of that 5 billion-year-old ecosystem that are busily protecting Michael so he doesn't have to answer difficult questions, because that obviously makes his life more comfortable. But how is that any different than anything else going on? And in that sense, one doesn't need to write a book about surrender if one is surrendering, except in the paradox, of course. If you want to write a book about surrender, then write it. Just as if you want to argue about that, then argue. And if you want to fight for the dignity of your corporation, then fight. Because all of those impulses, including the defense and the whole thing, are all part of a $5 billion ecosystem that's been humming along for 5 billion years. So who are we to judge that fighting the ecosystem isn't part of the ecosystem, since we're in the ecosystem that we're fighting? And since cells in the body fight bacteria and get rid of it, who's to say Michael shouldn't fight my email and get rid of it? And who's to say I shouldn't fight irrational aspects of Michael's ideas and get rid of those? The consciousness that is in between all these data points, which is true. There's a vast amount of energy out there that's in between all of these different data points, and it's the 99.9% of space between the proton and the electron, between the planets, between a given second, between this conscious thought and the next conscious thought. There's space, there's feminine energy, there's presence all around all of that, and yet the human consciousness usually accesses pieces of that through language, through conversations like this that lead to consciousness. And so I just witnessed that, and I think it would be great if Michael Singer had the surrender or the assertion, doesn't matter the language, to bring consciousness to this paradox. Because inside paradox, there is an incredible amount of packed energy that's waiting to be liberated back into presence. It is an invitation. Now, I thought about it a little more, and I'll try and mention it over my hiccups. But going back to the design analogy, where you have beauty is often composed of a balance between, for example, in architecture and landscape, the formal and the informal. The order and the chaos is kind of the ultimate yin-yang tension in the universe. And we tend to be happiest in a sweet spot, in a symmetry of chaos and order. And so Michael took the stand for the truth and integrity of his company with a $190 million lawsuit. I've never been drawn that much towards corporate life, though that's a possibility. And I would probably do the same thing. I wouldn't call it surrender. I would call it fighting for a truth, or defending a truth. And in that balance between order and chaos, one of the balance points is between sanity and insanity, where you have insanity where people say, my hand is moving down when it's going up. Now my hand is moving up and it's going down. What you're hearing there are not hiccups. They're not even happening. This is not blue, it's red. And this is not a necklace, it is a chainsaw. I use it to cut trees down. We're getting into the domain where consciousness cannot function. Because if I call this a chainsaw and somebody else calls this a chainsaw, and somebody else says this is a Martian from Mars, and I say I'm a male from the United States, we get to a point where the map is so fuzzy that we cannot function. We're paralyzed in chaos. And this is the same thing with the landscape design, which I do, where if the paths lead to dead ends, if the wall blocks the way to the front door, if there is no path at all and there's a jungle, and you say, welcome to my home, and you have to go through sharp spines and thistles to arrive at a door that doesn't actually open, it's not a welcome. It's a barricade. You cannot flow through that domain. And as someone growing up with insane parents who have intense blockades around looking at certain areas of reality that I experience, there's a certain blockade to the validity of my existence, because I say I feel this, and they say you shouldn't feel that, you should feel this because of this. And I say I feel this because of this, and they say no, you shouldn't do that. And no, we're not abusing you, and this is a spiritual act, and blah, blah, blah. One of my greatest vulnerabilities is succumbing to insanity, because I'm surrounded by so much of it, culturally and otherwise. And so what I defend is sanity, a certain coherence in thinking. And so the question of an abused child with insane parents that are using insanity to call abuse love is, if the child participates indefinitely in the abuse, they will be destroyed by calling incest love as examples, by calling lies truth. And the body will die. And in the hierarchy of human needs to survive, to feel secure in that survival, to feel a sense of love and belonging, to move towards a sense of self-acceptance or self-esteem, to develop our gifts and to contribute them to the world. We cannot do that with a dead body. If the child believes the insanity that, for example, sexual molestation is love, then they will go out loving people and start molesting other people, who, if they're then told that that's love, at some point the civilization disappears, because if I go out and buy something toxic for the environment, then the balance that we need to have with our ecology starts to become distorted. And so one of my biggest protections with New Age spiritual teachers of all kinds is, are they sane? Do they understand what they're talking about, and does their map fit with reality? And so that's a filter protecting sanity from the insanity and the chaos of everything that harms the system being relabeled as beneficial. Well, the more that happens in an unbalanced way, in situations of vulnerability and in an asymmetry, for example, the Department of Justice was using the reputation of our government and taxpayer money to attack an innocent man. And the same is being done with Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange. And I send money to fund that defense, just as if I understood, I would put Julian Assange's work, because it's truth-telling, above medical records, so I would defend media before I would send money to help Michael defend his company. Not because it isn't important, but it's a hierarchy of importance. And so I wonder, in Michael's path, would he support Julian Assange for also being attacked by the federal government for telling the country the truth about our military atrocities that will lead to greater terror, because they are terrorizing other people, who in turn grow up with PTSD and resentment towards our country, thus abusing federal tax dollars to actually incite terror, as opposed to, when Abu Ghraib goes buried because everyone's intimidated by, they know if they tell the truth about U.S. atrocities, they will be attacked just like Michael Singer was, for telling the truth that his company was innocent. In other words, when there's something good about my parents, there's something good about Waldorf education, there's something good about the therapists who actually abused me sexually. But when there's something good and there's something rotten, there's something that is insane, if you surrender to that to a certain point, and my therapist who sexually abused me under the influence of psychedelics told me he was loving me while ignoring everything I had to say, and is now attacking me for telling the truth about what happened, which is on a recording. And this is anything but surrender. It's one of the first times I felt impassioned enough to, sue someone. And the balance of exploitation and insanity seems dangerously thin in some areas. And so my defense of truth is more assertive and more detail-oriented than it would be if, for example, I'd grown up with authorities around me that would not exploit that innocence. And I value innocence incredibly highly as a spiritual doorway into the unknown. And so every attack and betrayal, insanity and on innocence to cover up an addiction, a blind spot, and silence it, that registers loud for me. And so it's not that I'm not deeply touched, which I am, and it's not that I don't understand, which I do, and it's not that I don't value, which I do, Michael's attitude around this truth that it takes an enormous amount of energy. And I could, just fall back and experience what it's like to be a sexually abused, repeat, buried under the carpet individual in our culture, like so many of our people are. But it is surrendering to an insanity and an imbalance. It's not a balanced system when the protector is the violator, and when the violated becomes the protector of the violator, and the protector of the insanity of the violator who wants that to be called love. And this piece is very nebulously dealt with in a lot of spiritual, meditative type traditions. And it seems, like for me personally, I would have less problem, surrendering to someone cut me off on the freeway, surrendering to the fact that people don't seem interested in this aspect of my service, they're interested in this one. I want to say something, nobody wants to listen to this in some areas than in this area, because I think trust in the ultimate ecology is also trust in the checks and balances. So as someone who has been psychologically and sexually violated, the extra sensitivity and reactivity and defense that is part of the ecology of which we are a part of, that's 5 billion years old, is a countermeasure in which I am a force of nature restoring balance within a system of which Michael is a part. And that is a to surrender to Michael's ideas of surrender in that area, when he is not surrendering to hear or to dialogue, is an asymmetry as well. It's his assertion asking for my surrender, and my assertion being met with a block. So there's an asymmetry there. And so I do, of course, surrender to Michael can blockade this as much as he needs or wants to, and that may be his part of the ecology. But I don't surrender to silence about that, in part because I've met so many confused seekers who seem to get hurt when there's these one-way messages without dialogue in these important areas, and they don't end up healthier in all cases. They end up, maybe I should just not tell anyone about my abuser because that would be easier. Let's just surrender to the abuse happening, and the next person will be harmed just as much, and that's just the way it is. And so that's part of what I surrender to, the surrendering to the counterbalance, that when someone is violated in a tender area, they're more defensive against that same kind of violation. When someone is, repeatedly ignored in these areas, they're more assertive to speak, because that's also part of nature. And I'm interested because Michael has superior skills to myself in this process of letting go. I'm interested in how he sees and intersects around this. And I'm much more interested in whether it's, learning his meditation approaches, etc., to a teacher who will learn and who will also respond and surrender to the student, as opposed to so much of our current paradigm of our culture is that you're supposed to be a teacher, and you're a good teacher if you sell lots of books and you talk to, but not with, your student. Because this is also an aspect of our culture that is very, very unusual. 500 years ago, there were no, you have dogmatic teachings such as the Catholic Church and stuff that won't listen, that they just tell you you're a sinner if you diverge in any way. But for the most part, for most of human history, we're with our teachers, watching them in daily life, able to ask questions, going back and forth. And I think that's a much safer way of getting a map of these things than it is to put people on pedestals and just consume, information from a book and not have dialogue. And because it's very easy in a culture that damages the inner voice so much. Michael is very gifted and blessed in this arena because he dissociated from the culture to develop his inner truth. But for someone who hasn't done that and who just sees Oprah and this and that, and they all like Michael Singer, so maybe I should surrender to sexual abuse. They have no one to ask in a culture like ours. And so I think this is a really important voice, and I think it is an ethical responsibility for a teacher that's putting forth a one-way message, meaning Michael's message is to surrender more. His life is both, obviously, because if he just, to give an example, as I mentioned in my letter, if he was completely surrendering to anyone asking for things, then I'd like him to help me code an app that I think will help people in these areas, and I'm expecting him to say no, because I'm sure there's plenty of other people. But this brings in the responsibility of the human ego to decide, I'm going to say yes to this and I'm going to say no to this. And that can be to attune to the larger picture, but it is as much a yes and a no as any other thing. It's just I'm trying to listen to the larger environment. And so maybe 3 people would have to ask Michael to write, to participate in something like this before he would say, the universe wants me to, so I'm going to surrender to it. Because in his book, he listens for a sign. I could be that sign, but obviously not if the communication doesn't get through. And I'm also have a little sensitivity because, it's one of the abuse defenses in the New Age. When people say, I have nothing to do with it, it was just meant to be. It's like, who's the one who had who's the one that had that great meditation and said, I want to devote my life to feeling this state? That was a human ego saying, I have experienced bliss. I want to have more of that, so I will meditate, and I will see what happens. And then I ran out, that didn't work. And there's an ongoing learning process between the larger ecology and the ego. And this is a very natural part of my voice, and there's some defense around this and tightening, because a typical person who likes to write books does not want to shake the pedestal in any way with engaging like this. So typically I am brushed aside in this inquiry. And again, I have to defend, because there's a part of me that says, oh, this isn't valuable. Nobody wants to hear this. This isn't valuable. And I can surrender to that voice that says, nobody, Michael doesn't want to talk about this, Brené Brown doesn't want to talk about this, so-and-so doesn't want to talk about this. And so I could surrender to I'll just shut up. Or I can surrender to this voice and have some defensiveness against that message that's constantly telling me to be quiet because other people don't want to deal with what they don't want to deal with. And yet the sense of symmetry, the sense of balance, seems to be served precisely by talking about those things that nobody wants to talk about, because that's part of the tapestry. That's part of our reality. And my observation of nature and science is that when the taboo and the unexplored and the paradoxes are opened, there is a bigger world in thought, in consciousness for everyone, and there is a saner world. And so, I'm going to push in a little bit more and give a little bit of flack to that, that constant message, we don't have time for that, we don't have time for that, we don't have time for that. And that's a pattern that seems, it's certainly asymmetrical in my life relative to authors and teachers asking to hear back and being interested in a response. So that's a little bit of the meta around the meta, for how this becomes important to me. And one of the reasons that I've put it into a mentor framework on my site was I think that consciousness has medicine when it sees and observes the pattern. And so even if the pattern is that this voice in the human psyche is not welcome at the table, when this pattern is presented, it helps the consciousness restore balance, is kind of how I've come to see it. So that's it.